Welcome to the More with Murphy podcast, a podcast all about discovering more in every area of life. We hope you enjoy this episode and embrace the more within.
Diane, thank you so much for joining us on More with Murphy with Serena and I. Want to have just a conversation, get a few things out of the way as we get started. Number one, you are my sister, my oldest sister, and you are a physician. You're a doctor. So thank you for being on us with the podcast here today. Give us the short version of your work experience, because honestly, we were talking, it's been an eclectic background.
It has. Some people would call it confused and disorderly, but I am trained as a pediatrician with a specialty in adolescent medicine. And so from the very beginning, I really was drawn to working with adolescents and teenagers. I think that even before going through medical school and training, I was drawn to working with the youth group. I loved youth group growing up. Drawn to working with the youth group in college, did a lot of volunteering with the youth group. And so again, I think adolescents, a lot of people bemoan that time. I think they're amazing. I think that I love working with adolescents. But I think that the most important thing for working with adolescents is to recognize how different they are and how changing they are. Was in private practice for almost 18 years and then transitioned out and did part-time practice still, but then worked in a nonprofit organization where I launched a sex ed program in a large community in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And so we taught sex ed in 17 different high school systems throughout the city. And again, the issue around sexuality, I think growing up in the church, one of my probably biggest concerns is that we don't address sexuality in the way that it should be addressed. And I think we are doing a better job of that. But when I was growing up, it was basically, God said, don't have sex till you get married. That's it, period, end of discussion. None of the other things around that. And I think that that is a disservice to our adolescents and to our families. And it's not a one-time the talk that you need to have. And I think what has happened in our society today is that there are so many, for lack of a better term, I will call it aberrant reactions to sexuality. You know, you have the normal sexual relationships that you talk about that you expect in marriage between a man and a woman or through dating relationships, but now there's so many other things thrown into it. And that becomes very confusing. And I think that as parents, and now myself as grandparent, unless you spend the time understanding it and getting to know it, you're going to feel inadequate to have that conversation. And so you are going to tend to not discuss it and hope that it goes away, and it won't. And so from that experience then in Colorado Springs, then I went on, and most recently I spent 3 years working in Washington, D.C. as Director of Adolescent Health for the Division of Health and Human Services, and worked a lot with primarily working with looking at what are the kinds of conversations that you can have. And it was really surrounding research. What are the programs that are the most effective? How can you, it's not that the concept has to be proven. It's how do you take that concept so that a group of people will understand it and then internalize it, and thus their behavior will change. And again, that's a whole different aspect to it. But probably what concerns me the most is that I think as conservatives and as Christians, we are being bombarded by a very vocal minority. And don't be confused by the fact that this is the minority. It is still the minority.
No, when you say the minority, what do you mean? By
minority, I mean those that ascribe to being transgender in themselves, being same-sex attracted to themselves. Yes, it is there. There is no question it is there. However, it is not the majority of people. And if you spend any time listening to the news, if you look at the direction that culture tends to be going, if you look at the way we, for lack of a better term, want to cancel the culture that is against this belief system, you would think, oh, the vast majority of people in America or the world agree with this. And that is not true. Where we have to come to understand is what are the issues surrounding it and where do we need to be to help everyone navigate through this, but particularly our young adults, our adolescents and our young adults, as they are going through these confusing times.
Well, I think even you've had several parents, moms particularly, come with that same question, asking, how do we navigate the conversation?
Yeah. And I understand it, and I have to remember that it's the minority, but at the same time, it sometimes it doesn't feel like it is.
There's no question. And it's because it's a very loud minority. And I don't want to be offensive here. And so I'm trying to be very careful, but many times, and I can say this because it was from personal experience, if I had a conservative view around this, I was bullied by a large group of people. And, certainly being on a national stage, that occurred more openly. And it, occurred in the form of newspaper articles and people making conversations, and not everybody has that. But it feels the same if you're in your neighborhood or you're at the PTA, right? Or you're walking in and you're in a group of parents and have that same conversation. Suddenly, if you are standing up for a conservative view or a value on this, suddenly you feel like, I'm in the minority. Now, if I think back to, my historical church upbringing, we should expect that, right? I mean, Jesus talked about the fact that these principles, the world is going to hate you. Didn't say they're not going to like you. They're not going to want to go to dinner with you. They will hate you. And I think that is true.
And I think to be honest, there are many Christians and churches who have not handled the conversation well.
No question.
Which their attitude and approach to people who have different beliefs, whatever the belief may be, has frankly been far more ugly than gracious and loving. And I do think that's one of the struggles of culture and society is I actually do believe it's possible to be loving and have respectful conversations with people who don't believe the same things you do. And you can actually have a genuine love and care for the person, but at the same time, not actually say we don't actually believe the same things, but that's not a hindrance to our love, at least for me to you, because I think society sometimes says if you don't fully endorse my truth or what I believe, then you are the hateful one. And I just don't believe that's true. Disclaimer, the three of us are Christ followers, because there are many people who will be listening that will have a variety of belief systems. So everything we say ultimately is probably going to be reflective of a bottom line worldview that the three of us, the expression of that. I want to, we'll talk about that a little bit, but I want to even you never set your Christianity on the shelf or to the side, but more just from and again, just the conversation of how do you process Christian or not Christian or Buddhist, Muslim, whatever your background may be, secular humanism, how do you have these conversations? I would say just a conservative viewpoint of sexuality. And one of the questions, I guess...
Because in our high schools and even, parents have come to us, I know it's a minority, but it just does seem to be a lot of people, they're transitioning. They're figuring out what they want to be. That sort of thing. So it's
and all respect to the LGBTIQA culture and society, but it is the minority, no question. But it seems to be a dominant conversation, particularly with adolescent young girls.
Mm-hmm. I think there are a couple of things about that when you understand adolescent development, it makes sense. And so from putting on my adolescent pediatrician, hat at this point.
Which I was going to add, she is married to a doctor who's an OBGYN, and she likes children so much you have 4 of your own.
That's right. And 10 grandkids, which are really more fun.
That's crazy.
Should have had grandkids first. They're just a lot more fun. But I think that it is completely normal and very common for adolescents as they're developing to have confused feelings about their gender. And the first thing you need to understand is
confused feelings about everything. And
everything. But gender becomes a big deal. But you need to understand that there's a difference between sex and gender. Okay, sex is biological. It is straightforward. There is not a question about that. When there are biological genetic differences between males and females, No question. There are those genetic biological differences are expressed in every organ, every cell of the body, because every chromosome, through the DNA, whether it's an XX, which makes you a biological female, or an XY, which makes you a biological male, every single cell in your entire body is reflected upon that. And that combination then is reflected in the way your heart works, in the way your lungs work, in the way your skin works, in the way, and especially the way that your organs, your reproductive organs work. All completely there. Gender is an expression of that. And we have for a long time been very typically gender stereotypic, right? And it's very difficult to get away from that. But that tends to be what causes the most angst, particularly in younger parents, as their kids are growing up and they see their son and all he wants to do is wear dresses, right? That seems to be a more difficult thing to take than for their girl to want to be a tomboy and excel in sports, right? Mm-hmm. If you think through the different kinds of stereotypic kinds of things. And so then people worry, well, why does my son want to play with dolls all the time? Why does my daughter, want to play with trucks all the time? Again, that is not biologic. Okay. That is very much socially determined and gender determined based on what your expression is. There is a medical condition called gender dysphoria. And as much as people want to try to discount that, there's no question it is there. And it is a psychological response. And again, the field of psychology, the brain, is so complicated that it is very difficult to determine which is what. But we know for certain that there are environmental factors and there are genetic factors that come into emotional responses. And my concern about the whole gender transition thing is that we are allowing life-changing, non-reversible decisions to be made at a very young age when confusion is normal. And if we wait until someone is older, where we know that most of the decision-making has been made at a certain point, for them to then make that decision, again, what I personally agree morally about that or not is a far different situation for me than a young child.
I agree, 100%.
Or an adolescent. That is where the problem comes in. We have made decisions as a society that adolescents cannot drive until a certain age for lots of reasons. They are not allowed to drink a certain age. They can't sign up to go into the army for a certain age. They can't vote until a certain age. At school, you can't get an aspirin without a note from your parents, right? So all of these things we've decided. However, how is it that this kind of a decision can be made? And in some states, the state makes that decision against the parents' wishes in many cases. It's not very common, thank goodness, but it's one of those things that could go. And at that point, that's where it becomes very confusing. Why is it that we are allowing that kind of permanent decision to make? Now, comes back to the question, if your child is questioning that, right? And they're concerned about that, there can be a lot of reasons psychologically that could happen. Particular case in point that I know of specifically, where there was a situation where a young boy wanted to be a girl and was very adamant about it and was going down that path. And when the parents made the decision, okay, let's explore this because we don't understand where this is coming from for sure, but let's explore this. And it's important that you find a counselor or a psychiatrist or an endocrinologist that can help you see, is there a biologic reason why this is happening? Is there an emotional reason? Is there something about this that made it seem better to be a girl than to be a boy? You think about the stresses and the pressures that happen socially and all of the risks that happen. Is there a reason why it would seem better for me to be a girl? This whole sports transgender thing, and again, I'm probably stepping into really deep mud right now, but if you are a boy and you have not been able to make the team at your level, Okay. And suddenly, if you transition into being a girl and you compete against girls who you cannot argue there is a difference. So there's a difference in muscle mass. There is a difference in even the top athletes in the world. You look at the differences in the times, in particularly track and field and different things like that. There's just a difference that is there that doesn't change, right? Would that draw you to want to do that? Would that be a piece of the puzzle?
I actually believe there's lawsuits in Connecticut at the high school level currently due to this very issue of boys who are either identifying as female or are to some degree or another in the process of transitioning to a female, competing in girls' high school sports, predominantly it is track and field, winning fast and away.
No question.
What used to be the state record holder the year before, and they're now gaining scholarships to go to college. And now you have legal ramification.
Yeah. Talking about going back to young kids that want to transgender, and they say so many of their parents, it goes back to their parents go, oh, I'm going to let them choose. I mean, from birth, they're like, before when they're born, we're going to let them choose. I mean, we've heard that said over and over again. I'm going to let them choose what they're going to be. I think it goes back to, if parents would be, that's part of, like you keep saying, that's part of adolescence. It's part of trying to.
But the reality is you can't choose then because it's been biologically set.
Right, yeah.
Okay?
No.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah. And I think it's a lack of understanding of that. If you are born with XX, there are very few, very, very, very rare conditions where there is an abnormality in development, where there is a confusion. Very rare. That's not what we're talking about. That's incredibly rare. That's a whole different situation. This is, XX chromosome, XY chromosome. That is set in stone when you are born. Now, you can choose a lot of different directions you go in. You can choose how you, follow through on that, but it's not going to change what your innate biology is.
Isn't there a element?
Even with hormones. Okay, let me say that again.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, because people go, well, you just take hormones and you change. No, that doesn't change your DNA. That changes the expression of the hormone on some of your body parts.
And you don't even know what.
But again, it never, you can't make it the way that it was designed to be made. There are artificial things that people try all the time to try to get close to that, but it's not the same thing. And it never changes. Taking hormones does not change your chromosome XX.
Yeah.
And here's my concern. As a physician, I'm taking care of someone who comes into my office or the emergency room primarily. I don't know this person. Emergency room coming in, they say they're a man. Okay, so there's a whole list of things that I don't worry about if they're a man. Right? Well, what happens if they're a woman that's transitioned to a man? And I'm not even thinking that, and I don't even go down that road, and they don't want to answer to me if they were or not. The protected private medical information, I could miss a lot of very serious things. There are blood tests that should be done on men as they get older that don't need to be done on women. Vice versa. Blood tests on women that need to be done for health and preventive. You come in and that isn't a conversation that happens. You're in an emergency situation. There are mistakes that are going to be made as a result of that. That's a huge concern. So it's a misnomer. And as I talk with people about this, there are many people who think, oh, if I take hormones, it changes me. No. It never changes, never, ever changes the DNA that was there when you were born. It changes some of the outward manifestations of it.
Yeah.
Can women grow beards with enough testosterone? Yes. What does that extra testosterone do to their DNA that wasn't meant to have that testosterone and the damage that it does internally? Significant. Nobody talks about those things.
Yeah. I just think about the teenagers and young adults that we've know and parents that have talked to us and stuff like that. I've also heard and heard a podcast that once they start going down that road, it's hard to come back. And if they hear that stuff ahead of time, what they start taking the hormones, they don't know what it's going to do to their body in the long run.
Well, long-term steroid use.
Right.
Yeah.
Jose Canseco.
Right.
It's, you take steroids enough for long enough.
And there are different kinds of steroids that that affect that. But many times, particularly women who are wanting to transition into being men, to build up muscle mass and that kind of thing, there are significant side effects to that.
We had heard a statistic, just to talk about, that there is I don't remember the percentage, but of teenage girls, probably boys too, I don't know, but definitely girls and young adults that are transitioning. I mean, it's increasing, but yet the 40, 30, 40, 50-year-old women, it's going down that are transitioning. I mean...
Well, and again, I think that goes back to the confusion,
Mm-hmm.
the gender identity around that. I'm transitioning. I'm not accepted as a girl, so maybe I'll be accepted as a boy.
And I think
Right?
it
I mean, again,
comes down to so
I'm
much
simplifying this very simplistically because it's not as easy as that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are deeply embedded psychological, we call them adverse childhood events, okay, that affect people emotionally. We know that that is the primary cause of drug use and opioid overdose and drug use and suicide.
Say that one more time.
Adverse childhood events, things that happen in childhood, a variety of them. Some from natural kinds of disaster things, or tragic things that have happened in families, and other types of abuse types of situations that they've been involved with. And we know now that the leading cause of future drug abuse, opioid use, leading to overdose, suicide, is a result of adverse childhood events. Excellent looks at some of those things. So as a parent, as you're looking at some of these things, some of those adverse childhood events you couldn't have prevented. But they're there so that you can help your child with counseling to work through that, right? So being proactive about that, having those conversations, that comes from having healthy parents, right? I mean, you understand the issues where you have parents who are unhealthy. And I know that in a number of situations that I've been personally involved with, the push for transgender comes from one parent, separated parents. The other parent doesn't want that. There's the fight amongst the parents. Can you imagine where the childhood is emotionally in the middle of this?
Well, and that's what I was going to say. The families that I think that you and I, that we know, there's two camps. One is there's at least one parent or both who are either affirming or they're at least embracing, not just of their child, but of the exploration of this path. And then there's another camp that they're like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to have a conversation. What do we do? And I really think part of this, and even in listening to you here today, there's a strong social, relational, and psychological component that's very rarely talked about. Everyone focuses on the sex, identity, gender issue. Go back to when the three of us were in high school, super long time ago, longer for some than others. Yeah. No social media, but one of the things I will always remember in high school, there were cliques, there were groups. You had jocks, you had the smart kids, we all had our different, and you would do things, maybe even conform your own behavior beyond your own belief to simply fit in.
Sure.
And I know there's been multiple studies that show that. My question is, with the rise of this conversation dominating an entire generation, the role that social media portrayals in Hollywood, TV, movie, just entertainment, this is what's been glorified as you're really special if you're this. Do you see that as well?
Sure.
Or it's just
the end thing.
it's just a way to you
Fit
found
in.
your group. And you want to fit in.
I agree, for sure. And I think, the more that the media that surrounds it, the more that it creeps into your music, videos, into movies, into different things like that, the more that's going to be seen as something to attain for. It's the in thing now.
Well, and let's go back to the 60s. What was shock value in
For sure.
music industry?
Right.
And then what was it in the 70s? What was it in the 80s? Lord have mercy. If you look at what shock value is today,
Right.
there's no question that line is constantly being pushed.
Right.
10, 15, 20 years ago, what was radical then, radical now? So let me ask you a question. for the parent that's listening, who is of a more conservative nature, not even saying Christian, but more of a conservative nature in their belief of issues of sexuality, when society, and it's not just social friend groups on, social media, but whether it be school systems, whether it be whatever the popular voices are, would portray a different worldview, talk to the parent, what are their resources they can turn to, and how do they have a conversation with their child? Because we're just talking about issues of sexuality. There are a million issues we could talk about. What's your advice as a mom, a grandma, and a pediatrician? How do we process that then?
I think that there are a lot of good resources out there that can help parents navigate through this. And I will leave a list for you of those.
Put them in the show notes.
Right. We'll do that. And I think that there are a lot of places that you can go. There's a lot of things you can read. My caution about that is that you have to take each of your children is different.
So true.
And so it's hard. I can remember very clearly when we had our first child and we had a behavior issue and we had figured it out and it worked and it was great. And we thought, boy, we're going to go on the speaking tour. We can write a book, we can do this. And then our second child came along and it did not work at all. And it was like one of these eye-opening moments where you're like, okay, hello. It's obviously God's sense of humor in a lot of things. But I think that's one of the reasons. And I think that having open and early conversations is really important. And so for people who say, well, that's great, that's good, my kid's already too old for that, I missed that opportunity, what do you do? And I think that surrounding them with people that are like-minded is very, very important. And I think that in the situation of the church here, where you have the youth group and you have the small groups that are being led by people that are allowing kids to talk through issues, that are helping to direct them back, I still think that and this is from a personal standpoint, but the information that we have that we can share with our kids, no question, goes back to the Bible. And it's there, and it's all there. And it has worked over the years, over the generations, over the centuries. God's word works regardless of where you are. And people say, well, this is such a different time. Well, if you read anything about the years of Nero, it's not so much different. In fact,
their sexual expression was even crazier than what's commonly held today.
And so again, this is not something that's taking God by surprise. But I do believe that what has happened to the American church is that we have taken a position of, well, I need to accept that because it's what they've decided. And I agree with that to the standpoint of, yes, absolutely, you have the freedom to make a choice, whatever you have. But I also have the ability to explain to you why I believe what I believe and need to stand up against that. And recognizing that it is going to be swimming against the current. And it takes strength to swim against the current. But most of my age group, and certainly the generation before me, grew up in an era where the majority supported that culture.
Ward and June Cleaver.
Right. I still believe the majority supports that, but the minority is louder. And with social media, it's becoming more apparent. So it seems like there's more of a majority there, right? And so I think that is not the time to sit back and say, well, okay, it is the time to be able to stand up and support those around you to help them see they're not alone. And it's the same thing, finding the group that you're comfortable with, a group that believes this. Yes, you can believe that. And while you think that if I don't agree with you, I don't love you, that is not true. And I will keep saying that until I am blue in the face. I do not agree with that. However, it doesn't change the way I can relate to you. And I don't dislike you because you think that. Now, you dislike me because I think what I'm thinking, but I truly don't dislike you.
Yeah.
That's where we have to be. And we
Yes.
have to be able to have those conversations and equip people to have the conversation.
One of the things, Serena, I think that she has done both individually with our three sons and then even collectively at the dinner table. I mean, they talk about everything, anything and everything. And even like, I mean,
we both have. I mean, always.
but like family dinner,
Yeah.
like
and just constantly like put them in the right environment. You, as a parent, you do have the ability to surround them with the right people,
Right.
and make sure they're at student ministries and they're in the right small group and they're around either coaches or friends or teachers or whatever that have. We've raised our kids with another family that has the exact same values we do. We go on fun vacations together because it was an in group. I mean, it was the fun group and it was a
Make it
bigger
fun.
group than just the family. And we all,
Right.
And then we've talked about just that. Do you see that life, that choices that person's making, that will lead, watch, it will lead to this, watch, you just watch. And it does. And so they've been able to see and process that. But yeah.
And I think the other thing in these conversations, it rarely happens on a set time when we as parents want it to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Like you'll see that window of in fact, it's funniest. Just recently, our youngest, he said, "Hey, if you can't tell, I'm ready to have a conversation. So you got 10 minutes. Like ask
Many questions you want.
Get all your questions in you want right now." But I mean, there's just
Right.
times it's like, and then, yeah, you just, all right, let's go somewhere.
I think that it's hard for some parents to let go of the fact that other people are judging them for the way the choices their kids are making. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's something parents have to get out of as well.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that particularly the older your child gets, you're responsible for giving them the information. You're responsible for training them, putting them in the right situations, but you are not their conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And you are not the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
And there is a time when you have to step back and say, and again, this is a certain age. I think I'm a firm believer of as long as they're in the house and I'm paying the bills for them, they follow my rules.
Yep.
Amen.
And at any point,
I cannot
at
stress.
any
Yeah.
point you don't want to follow my rules, then, fine, have at it.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're on your own. And that's hard to do because
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to say.
Especially if you haven't. It's easy if you haven't started doing it from the very beginning.
Well, but even then, you may have said it from the beginning, but you've never really come across a situation where that's really true.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that happens, and then your mother love and your father, it becomes difficult. But there is no question that you are not doing your children any favors by not following through with that. The structure, the rules, the things that are set up, they may or may not continue those as they set up their own families and their things, but they will remember what that structure is. And probably one of the most gratifying things for parents is to see, okay, thank God they're not making some of the same mistakes we did.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
However, look at the things that were critically important to us that they are establishing within their families as their
Mhm.
families
Yeah.
grow. And that is, there's nothing greater. I think there's actually a verse that says there's no greater joy than
Mm-hmm.
to see that my children walk in love
Mm-hmm.
and faith. And that there's no question about that. That's a long-term view. So right now, don't be afraid of the questions your kids are asking.
Mm-hmm.
Don't shut them off by saying, if your child comes to you with something and says, this is how I feel, you don't say, oh no, you're fine, which we tend to do because we want to make them feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
The better response is, what makes you say that?
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
How are you feeling about that?
Mm-hmm.
So-and-so hates me. Oh no, they don't. They really like you. No, very wrong answer. What makes you say that? What did they do that made you feel that way?
That's good.
Yeah.
So I think those are the things that help to open up conversations. And don't be afraid of those conversations. And if there's a tension between you and your kids, let go of your pride
Mm-hmm.
and find somebody they can talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And back away from having to know everything that's going
Mhm.
on. I can tell you that will be the hardest thing you have ever done.
Mm-hmm.
But let go of your pride.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're seeking, but they don't want to talk to you. For some reason, there is a hesitancy. And please don't let it's near and onto impossible to not take that personally.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a time when you are not the smartest person in your kid's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When they're 2, 3, 4, maybe up to about third grade, you can do no wrong. And then you can do no right for a really long time. And then it comes back around. Again, it will. But you have to, in that time, make sure that there's people there
Mm-hmm.
that they can connect with.
I mean, with a couple of ours, we said, yeah, well, then go ask so-and-so.
Right.
See what they think. Talk to them about it.
Right.
I think one of the great, I think it's harder to be a parent today than it ever has been. I think it's more challenging to be an adolescent, a child, a teenager, a young adult today than it ever has been. But I believe that's also why it's required. There's a verse, teach a child when they're young. And, the word of God will never return void. That requires more faithfulness and more intentionality. And also the realization, you said it earlier a little bit, but there's never been a perfect parent.
No.
The only perfect parent was God, who created the perfect environment, provided everything perfectly for his children, in a way, Adam and Eve. And what did they do? They still did the very thing God said, hey, you can do whatever you want, just don't do this. They did the one thing, asked not to do. It's not a reflection on God. It was a reflection of their own free will and their free choice. But love restored that relationship, even though there were some consequences that, stuck with them. And I think that's where, I don't care whether it's sexual disease, pregnancy, I'm choosing to take hormone, whatever. It's not an issue of like love or not loving, but there's some lingering consequences emotionally, physically. I mean, there's just some things that will stick with you. So you want the best for your kids. And even if as a parent, our kids or grandchildren may be walking or exploring a path, you may not feel it's God's best. You just got to keep praying, keep loving, keep the relationship open, and allow God to do his work, his way, his time. And it may not even be in your lifetime.
Right.
But believing that word will not return void. Right. Is there anything else that you guys can think of? I mean, this is, again, we've covered a lot of ground. But as far as sexuality, adolescence, I mean, there's parents that would be maybe leaning. It's a different worldview than what the three of us would have. There are some that might be a similar worldview, but they're just trying to figure out, okay, my toddler touches himself in the bathroom. Should I be freaked out over that? Or is it just another body part? I mean, at what point do you...
There's a lot, and you'll leave resources.
All the resources, and we taught a little over a year ago or so, and we'll link to that as well. But are there any final words?
There's some great resources out there from some very trusted people. And I think that the only caution I would have is that there are a lot of experts out there, but they're also writing from their perspective. And what I've always said and told parents is, I'm going to give you resources. I'm going to give you people that I have used that information to help in my own family, but in your gut and beyond gut, it's in your spirit. I don't mean gut, I mean spirit. If you truly are a follower of Jesus, and again, we're back to this is where our worldview is. Every decision is made based around that. But if there's something in that doesn't feel right, don't just take that advice because of their name or their background or their information, their credentials, right? Seek out other advice. The scripture says that, wisdom comes from many voices, right? You get a couple of people telling you the same thing, and in your spirit that is confirmed. That's the direction you should go. And it may seem hard and it may not make any sense. But having those open conversations, having those boundaries that are there, that are set, recognizing your kids are going to push those boundaries, no question. And then relying on, beginning the day, ending the day, all throughout the day, committing them to God. Because believe it or not, he loves them more than you do. And he's seeking them as well. And that's the one truth that Steve and I have held on to throughout our experience as parents, is that he loves them more than we do. And we're going to mess up. And thankfully, they've been very forgiving. But it was all done in the attitude of raising them to be followers of Jesus. The most important thing.
Discerning about what resources and everything, follow your gut, which is the Holy Spirit. I mean, with parents, I think that it goes back to that. If you feel, and it's the Holy Spirit, if you're a follower of Christ and that's your foundation, they're sensing something that your kid is dealing with or something, I mean, pray about it. We've talked, I'm like, I feel like this is, and feelings I know not to follow, but I'm sensing that this
Holy Spirit prompting.
Something, you know what I mean?
There's something going on.
Something is going on. Help me watch for it. Let's watch. Let's bring it to the surface if it is, and see if we can, what it is, and
get over yourself if they don't want to talk with you about it.
Yeah.
Find someone for them to talk to.
And I've often said this we're married. You and Steve are married. There's times in parenting conversations, sometimes Serena talks me off the ledge.
Yeah.
There's
Right.
like we balance each other. Even for the single parent, there may not be another spouse, or maybe it's divorced and it's,
Contentious and
exes are not on the same page. That's why a small group, a close inner circle of girlfriends, or if you're a guy, your guy friends, your guys group, to just process, hey, my kid came home the other day, and always in a respectful way, but am I seeing this the right way? Help me respond in a loving way, in a relationally affirming way. But you want what you believe is best for your children, and you got to have those relationships as for us as parents to navigate what does it mean to parent whatever the issue may be.
And counselors. I mean, I'm all for that, but Christian,
no question.
make sure.
Diane, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the More with Murphy podcast. It's our hope that listening will help you discover and embrace more in your life. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and subscribe and feel free to share. You can also help us achieve more on the podcast by writing a review of the show. Positive reviews help us reach new listeners, grow the show, get new and exciting guests, and tell us what content you're loving. Who knows, we might just read your review on the show. Finally, if you want to learn more about our guests or the resources mentioned on the show, check out our website at morewithmurphy.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for More with Murphy.